Thanks for being here. Shape the Trainer. Our first workshop starts now. Dr. Kyle Oldham, without further ado, kick it off.
I thought you were going to give more of an intro than that. This is so much fun. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So we're going to have some fun today, hopefully do some small group conversations so you can get a chance to chat with other folks who are here today and really just share some information and talk through and workshop with each other how we can facilitate with inclusion in mind as a practice, right? And we know that inclusion brings with it a lot of baggage that we'll talk about in different ways. And so I'm going to ask that we use our chat function today in some different ways. I can't even find my chat button right now, so there's that. So let's just have fun with those things. And then we'll also then do some small group breakouts so you all can share with one another as well. And so just know that we are going to make this work, as Emily said. That we are starting off the shape sessions today. So with that said, want to get started, and I'm going to ask folks we're going to do some housekeeping things to know your platform. So it's Zoom. For those of you that may be saying, what is Zoom? It's so new. I've never heard of Zoom in the last 7 months since we've been in pandemic. This is what it might look like. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll have the options below that the arrows are pointing out to, where you can unmute your mic and mute your mic. We ask that and not have as much background noise coming in. And if you just want to yell at me while I'm talking, that makes it perfectly safe for you to do so. We ask that there's a video button, so you can either have your video on so we can see your faces or have it off. Either way, we just ask that you participate fully and that you are with us today. There's a participant list so you can see who is in the room with us. There's the chat box, so we ask that you click that because that's where we're going to do a lot of engagement, where you can pose questions, where you can resonate in with someone else that they are sharing. We ask that you don't click the share screen icon because you're going to get denied regardless. Then there's the record button, which most people won't be able to see because you don't have those access points. And then there's a reactions button. Your reactions button might work, it might not work, but it either gives you a set of hands or a thumbs up. So there might be things that I say that you just feel so passionate about. And so you might be like, thumbs up, I'm right with you. Or you can type that in the chat. So there's multiple platforms for us to engage with today. Also, there's some other pieces within your participant list where there is a yes and no button, I believe, that you can click. So if I'm asking a question, yes or no, you can click on those. There is a raise hand function as well on there. And so therefore you can also raise your hand if there's a question that you want to ask in the space that you want to verbally bring into the room. So hopefully everyone has their microphones working and that they can hear me. If there's technological issues that you are experiencing, please feel free to reach out to Emily and she will do her best to help you. If not, we love you anyway. So principles of community are a basis of the work that we do, and they are actually part of the basis of some of the sessions the session that we're going to have today, because inclusion being a first principle of community that is listed because it's in alphabetical order, but also it is the backbone and the foundation of what we're going to talk about today as a facilitator. And so hopefully those of you joining today are interested in thinking about facilitation skills, how you facilitate, what you facilitate, getting some tips and tricks around that, and then specifically thinking about it from that inclusion lens. So are folks ready to go? Are they good? We want to test our reaction buttons if they work. Herman, I saw your head, so I'm agreeing with you. Thank you so much. Great, I see all of these wonderful thumbs ups. And then I have like 8 screens that I want to go through just to see how that's working. Well, welcome. Oh, people clapping it up too. We're gonna have a good time this afternoon. All right, so with that, so tell me what you think. You can either put this in the chat for me. What brings you to this session today? A few words, hopefully not a diatribe or a dissertation, but just a few words. What brings you to this session today? Besides me, of course. If you're just gonna put my name, you can put that in there, I appreciate it. Oh, thank you so much, Latoya Noel. A+ for you. Joe, you get 2 A+. Want to be a better facilitator? Kyle, basically, of course. I mean, feed the ego, thank you so much. You all are so funny. Let's switch over to this. Want to be a more inclusive facilitator. Oh, and Emily, look at Emily getting them claps in there. Moving into a supervisory role and hoping to integrate best practices with students. Thank you so much, Herman, for being that seriousness in there. I appreciate it. I supervise many student staff, and I'm hoping to learn how to be a better leader, be a better facilitator, develop a more solid foundation. Topic is exceptionally important. Best practices. Always trying to learn new things about facilitating. And also, Kyle, you're welcome, hair flip. Right. So curious about how technology may impact inclusive facilitation. Ashlyn, that is a fantastic question. And I hope you continue to raise those types of questions as we go through, because I think that that's going to also be something that we have to continue to explore together, because I don't think there's one way to answer that. Sure. Cool. So next question then. What do you fear when facilitating? Nothing. I fear nothing. While you all are answering that, I do want to acknowledge that we don't have subtitles and closed captioning at this moment, because Emily and I discovered some interesting things about that. So if there are things that we can do to make accommodations better, please let Emily know, so we can continue to make this a better presentation. So not getting the outcome I planned for, being stumped, not knowing an answer. Pedro, that's both of us, right? We're always going to be there. Stepping in it, absolutely will always happen. Losing the group, getting off track. I do that all the time, Pamela. Freezing, misstatements, that my identities are going to impede my ability to be an effective facilitator. Absolutely, Kayla. Totally awkward silence, stepping in it, accidentally harming a student in a space that is supposed to be safe. For sure, if someone derails the conversation, I have to think quickly on my feet to bring it back on topic respectfully. Well, sometimes you don't need to be respectful. Sometimes you just need to snatch some souls and just bring it back, you know? Like, we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. Being stumped and not knowing how to recover. I agree with Pamela, losing the group, absolutely. Losing audience interest, lack of engagement, technology issues, lack of group involvement. So it looks like there's a lot of commonalities that we will have here. The presentation will be on YouTube. I'm just reading everything that's coming in the chat now. And then missing the mark on student engagement. So absolutely. So this is good that there's a lot of engagement pieces, and it's around some of the keeping people interested or not knowing what to say. And so that is some of the things that we will be talking about today. And what I want to pose to you next is the next question, to see how your answers might actually change. What changes if you are facilitating around inclusion specifically, if anything? Addressing intersectionality, absolutely, Herman. More focused on the language that I am using, more anxiety, including all voices. The charge is different. What do you mean by that, Emily?
I think the topic is just charged in a different way. It can be personal, and so potentially differently harmful than like if I'm facilitating around Excel, right?
Absolutely, thank you. More mindful, your facilitation style might be examined more critically. So I think that ties in what Joe put out there, what ties in what you were saying, Emily. I reflect on my experiences with inclusion, absolutely, Michael. Humility as the facilitator, not being an expert on all issues / experiences. Yeah, I don't even know what humility means. I have to learn that word next time we get done with this. But absolutely, right? There's all these things that show up for us, right? And it's around the language, it's about setting up a whole, like we start thinking anxiously about who's going to be in this space today and what they're bringing with them. And sometimes that shift makes us step outside of what we actually are bringing into the space and what we know, but it also ties into the things that people shared around, you know, losing control of a group or misstatements or not knowing things. And so we have to understand that in order to be an effective facilitator, we have to have inclusion in mind from the beginning. No matter what we're talking about, even Emily, as you talked about, it's charged differently. Like, even if you're doing Excel, we still need to think about inclusion, right? So if you're talking about Excel, we need to know the inclusion might not necessarily be social identity based on the sense of, you know, thinking about like my experiences as a gay Black man, but it might be around the issues of what language am I using related to technology that the people that are in the session may or may not understand, or who has access to the technology that's needed. So if I'm sharing my screen, or if I'm asking people to participate, Do they have multiple screens? Do they have access to do some of the exercises? And so it's really thinking about who is going to show up, but knowing that you have to think about all the eventualities. Using universally understood language. Thank you, Leo. That is very important, and it's hard because what's universally understood, right? We know that universal design in buildings is about centering those who need different access to the different parts of our facilities. And if we center that, then everyone will have access. But with language, it's so complex and complicated because we don't know what we don't know about the language of the users who are going to be meeting with us. And so it requires a little bit more of us talking through what we're actually doing. So for example, going back to what I shared earlier around apologizing for not having the subtitles because Emily and I had practiced it. You might have to take the time to step outside of the presenter mode and just talk about what's going on. And there's a vulnerability there because now people are going to start thinking, well, maybe this person don't know what they're talking about. And for my non-gender conforming and my female identified folks who typically present in front of groups, there's already an assumption that you aren't an expert or that you don't know what you're talking about because you might not present as a cisgender male. And that then complicates things. And sometimes you just need to name it. I know what some of y'all are thinking right now, but I do know what I'm talking about. I'm just sharing with you so you ain't on the same game. Again, that's my attitude coming through. So I apologize this afternoon. I haven't really eaten in like 24 hours, I feel like it. So maybe that's my hangriness coming through. But how do you name that for folks, right? And how do we talk about that as a universally understood language piece? And just a couple more things here is making space to address and name current climate as a facilitator. And it's absolutely Emerald. Mitigating conflict in the group, absolutely Pedro. That will ultimately arise. And we're going to talk a lot about conflict today. And then hopefully we are thinking about inclusion with every presentation, right, Cheryl? Exactly. And so what is it that we need to be including? And so some of that might not be as evident always, but we need to think and maybe have a baseline for us of asking those questions of what do we need to think about. So thank you all for putting that in there. This is great because a lot of what you shared are some of the items that I'm hopefully going to be able to tie back into, but also you'll see it coming up in some of the information that I share. And so the information that I will share, we're going to have some pauses. I'm going to share some pieces and then we'll have some pauses for folks to engage in small breakout groups and then have some reporting out happening. So that way you all can learn from each other because you actually do have more than you probably give yourself credit for to add to the conversation. And so that's part of owning in the experience and being an expert in some ways. And then by asking the questions that need to be asked as a part of being an inclusive practice for facilitators. So our flow for the day, we're going to talk a little bit about what facilitation is and a little bit about what it's not. Tips to consider for facilitating is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. And then self-awareness, we'll talk a little bit about that at the end, which ties into a lot of what we talk about around tips for to consider for facilitating. And then some things just to remember as you begin to, as you continue to develop your practice as a facilitator. And we know that all of us enter in from different places with different experiences, with different expertise on topics, as well as comfort levels with how we show up. And so knowing that that's gonna make your practice specific to who you are and what it is that you do when you're taking this information, because I can only give you the information, but how you make use of that is gonna have to work for you and your story and your social identity. So for a quick commercial break, Emily, what is our time today is until what time? 1:30, 2 o'clock, 5, 1:20, 5 p.m. Okay, 1:20, all right, got it. So what is a facilitator? So a facilitator is someone who balances listening with comments and should be structured so that they foster general discussion, right? A lot of times as a facilitator, if you're asked to facilitate something, you feel as though you have to have all of the answers and you have to give them all. And the reality is there's a balance there. You can have answers and you can have examples ready to go, but you don't always have to share those and put those out into the space. And so it's really about listening to the comments and evoking comments from the group. So I think back to, Herman, you said you were becoming a supervisor and you want to use some of these practices about putting a question out to the group and getting them to engage with one another and come up with ideas, right? And you're just listening and then you maybe dig a little bit further. So like with Emily, she put out the comment, you know, the charge is different. And I was like, so Emily, share with me what that charge, what do you mean by that? It's doing those things because yeah, I could have probably guessed half the answers you all put there, but it's not about me as a facilitator in that space. So a facilitator balances those listening opportunities. They avoid taking sides, right? and this is hard, particularly when it comes to inclusion. You're going to have that one person who's going to show up and is going to say something out of pocket. And all you're going to do is going to be like, really, you just said that, right? Like, you really want to do that. But as a facilitator, you sort of got to swallow that in a little bit. And you just got to be like, oh, tell me so much more. What do you mean by that, right? You could probably still see it on my face. You probably hear it in the tone of my voice. But you need to avoid taking sides, because as a facilitator, you're there to facilitate the group's learning together. Your role is to make sure that all sides are heard and discussed. And before you get on top of me about this and say, like, well, what about this, Kyle? Yeah, there are times where you're also going to need to sort of curb the conversation in a way, because you can see where it might be derailed and where it might be going off the rails to a place that is not going to be safe, comfortable, or brave for everyone involved. And that's where you have to sort of feel some of that. But as a facilitator, you want to make sure that you're trying to make sure you're bringing those voices in and that you're allowing the voices in the space to speak for themselves. The other thing is that allowing contrary views. So again, it ties back into, depending upon the topic, you're gonna have to allow some things to be brought into the space, because some of it could be learning, right? We know that some people ask, I was gonna say dumb questions, because there's not supposed to be something as a dumb question, but I truly believe there can be, sidebar. But it's around allowing people to sort of explore their own learning and asking their own questions. And so you need to find a way as a facilitator to prepare yourself for that. And so we'll get into it a little bit, but I'll give you a spoiler alert, is sometimes when I'm presenting topics and I know that it's going to be inclusion-based specifically, I try to think of all the questions that someone is going to come in with that's going to try to either make me feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, or prove me wrong, or try to derail the conversation. And I try to have all of those questions outlined, prepared, and have a nice answer, maybe even a stat ready to answer that, so I can, as we like to call it, clap back in the moment. So that way I'm prepared, right? But as a facilitator, you're going to want to make sure that some contrary views are being brought in, so that folks are learning and being able to explore, and that folks don't feel shut down completely. And then you want to seek examples as a facilitator, right? So when people mention abstract issues or discuss things in fairly general terms, you want to seek concrete examples or ask for more detail. And it's always, my favorite line is always, insert their name. Can you please tell me more about that? Or insert their name. Can you please explain more what you mean, right? Because that gives them the floor back to have to dig in deeper, right? And not just stay at that surface. And if we think about the iceberg model, for those of you who are familiar with it, when we talk about cultural competence, it's about what you see above the surface, but there's so much more below it. And a lot of people just like to stay at the top of the iceberg above the waterline. And sometimes you might have to ask the question of, tell me more what you mean, so that it digs below the water and exposes what's more below the surface of the iceberg. And that's where some of those questions that you can draw out will come. And we'll talk about what some of those might be. You with me so far? Have I bored you to death? Have I lost the group, since that seemed to be a fear of a lot of folks? Okay, just let me know if I have. It's okay. I'll send you my address to DoorDash me some lunch. Cool. So the role of a facilitator. And we sort of been talking about this with facilitators, right? Like, so you're a motivator. So as a facilitator, you need to motivate the group. You need to motivate the conversation. And it's not about being a cheerleader. It's not about always being positive, but it's about motivating folks to engage and figuring out, what does that mean? And trying to figure out what motivation looks like is going to be hard, because you might not know the folks in the space. If you're facilitating a group of folks who you've never met before, it's going to be on your toes, trial and error. If you're facilitating a group of students or a group of staff or a staff meeting, you might know them more, so you might understand what motivation looks like. For example, I might be in a meeting and Pamela's there, and I know that Pamela's motivated by chocolate. So I might like have some chocolate in the middle of the table and say, okay, folks, everyone grab a piece of chocolate and ask a question. Or I might say, hey, I might not even let people know I have chocolate, but if I know most of the people in the room like chocolate, and if you don't, I'm not a person that really likes chocolate, I might have some candy or something like that. And then if someone asks a question, I might say, hey, yeah, thanks for that. You know, like you can do some things like that to motivate people. That feels a little different depending upon the group that you're in. But again, use your resources that you know will be available, because folks can be motivated differently. As a facilitator, you are a guide. So how do you guide the conversation? How do you guide the outcomes, right? You don't necessarily want to always just give all the answers and then say done, because you're not there to solve the problems. If you are being brought in to facilitate for another group of folks, then it's not your place to have the answers. It's not your place to be invested, really. You're not even totally invested in the outcome for the group. But how are you helping them get to where they're going to be? So if you've been asked to come into a group of coworkers who you don't supervise or who you don't work with on a regular basis, just to facilitate a conversation for them, how are you helping them guide to the outcomes that they have had? How are you learned what the outcomes they want to be, and how are you getting them to get there? You're a questioner, so you're always asking questions, right? So instead of being the person that's always sharing information, you're going to be the one that says, help me to understand what that means. What would that look like for you if that was the case? You mentioned that you want the outcome, that you want the group to be able to explore difference within communication. What does difference in communication look like to you, right? So you're always taking what someone says and ask a question back. Now, how many of you hate it when someone does that to you? Anybody? Bueller? I see you, Herman. Herman's like, some days. Anybody? How do you know that? How do I know what, Pamela? That I know to ask the question, or how do I know you like chocolate? Was that when that came up there? I see, I wasn't even paying attention. I knew that because of the 18 years that I've had to know you. But, right? So sometimes when you're the one that's always being bombarded with questions, you know what it feels like. So you can revel in the fact that you get to do that with other people as a facilitator. Or you figure out a way to ask the questions to make sure that people's voices are being brought into the space, right? And so as a questioner, you need to be panning and paying attention to what's happening in the space to see if there's folks who are not sharing. How do you bring them into the space? How do you create activities or opportunities or small group discussions for folks to be able to make sure that their voices are being shared, and you're asking certain questions differently? You're a bridge builder. And I'm not referring to like building an actual physical bridge. I'm actually referring to bridging together conversation points, right? So Pedro might offer something into the space, and then Daryl might then say something else. How do you connect their two pieces of information together? How do you bridge the content together? Or how do you help transition? Well, based upon what Michael shared, it looks like you know where you're going next. So then how do you facilitate into the next question and bridge that together? It helps with building camaraderie. It helps with building support for folks. It also helps motivate, right? If folks are being heard and validated in their contributions, folks will be more motivated to want to share more and engage more, right? So now if you start bridge building, you're going to start utilizing questions that you've had, and you're starting to motivate, and you're sort of guiding people to where you need to go. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the conflict personality types later, but it's really about also being able to shift the conversation the way that you know it needs to go to make sure that you're reaching the outcome as a facilitator. And you're not just being stuck in a cycle where folks just want to continue to process, and you know that you need to move forward and come to an answer. And then last but not least, I may have mentioned this briefly, but you're not a trainer, right? So there's a difference between facilitation and training. And while there are a lot of overlaps, because as a trainer, you're facilitating learning, see how I did that? But you don't need to be the expert at everything as a facilitator. You might need to have a few pieces of information in your pocket to help respond or guide or help make sure that folks are understanding where things are coming from, but it's not your job just to train specifically. And it's very meta right now that I think about it, that I am doing a training on facilitating and talking about not training as a facilitator. That was just meta, right? And so how do we figure that out? Because it is a fine line, right? And so as a facilitator, you need to remember that you don't have to be the trainer, and it's about getting the group to learn together and understand and help each other learn and grow together. Questions about facilitation so far, or around the role that I've covered? Because it's, like I said, we're just getting started, but I want to make sure I offer that space as I practice being a questioner.
Will these notes be available? These slides be available?
Yeah, the slides will be available afterwards. Emily will work her magic and figure out how to get that to you all. I don't understand it, but it will happen. Cool. All right, so we're going to break this into 3 different areas. So we're going to talk about skills, processing, and then I believe the last one, if I remember correctly, is conflict. Yes. So at the end of each section, we'll have some time to break into the small group breakouts, and that's where those will come up to get you to talk about what we've talked about so far. But the first one we're going to talk about is the skills of a facilitator. And these are not by any means all-inclusive skills of everything. So I'm talking about inclusion as a practice, but not including everything. I know the irony. So first and foremost is going to be climate setting, right? So a skill is to set the climate. And some of these are going to be very, very easy to do. Some of them are harder to do. And I think this ties back into Ashlyn, what you brought in around the online virtual environment, around technology. How does it impact inclusive facilitation? But it also impacts the ability to do some of these things, right? And so having name tags available, obviously your name tags are technologically available right now in a virtual space, right? But in a in-person space, if you are facilitating, if it's people that don't really know each other or you don't know who they are, having name tags is available is very important, and it's appropriate for the group. If you have a good memory and can memorize names, maybe you just tie that into an introduction. So you ask people to introduce themselves and then you memorize all the names of the people in the space. But definitely utilizing people's names and recognizing people and validating them by honoring them with their name is important, because it allows people to be seen, and it also builds that connection and motivates people to feel as though they are a part of the space. Greeting participants as they arrive is a great thing, but again, in a virtual environment, because you'll hear me keep saying this back and forth, because we're going to have virtual environments for the next 6 to 7 months, right? We just have to name it. If I busted somebody's bubble, I apologize, but that's going to be the case. Unless you can find spaces where folks can have their 6 feet of distancing, and you're about 3 or 4 people probably to be able to fit in a room, you're going to not be able to do some of these things. And so thinking around how do you greet people and how do you welcome people into a space is going to look differently virtually versus in person, but it sets that climate for folks wanting to begin to starting engaging with one another. You welcome them and introduce yourself as a facilitator and a co-facilitator if applicable. So you'll notice that some of these things are things that like Emily introduced me instead of myself introducing myself. But by introducing yourself, you're putting yourself into the space and trying to build that human connection with the other folks in the space. Because if someone just walked into a room and just started talking at you and you didn't know who they were, why they were there, or if you would even, or if they're even like a remnant of why they should be doing the presentation that you're attending, you're probably going to question things and be more focusing on that rather than focusing on who they are and being in the space. Inform participants of location of restrooms, lactation stations, water fountains, or refreshments is a great way to set an inclusive tone as well, right? You are being inclusive and thinking about the holistic person in that space, that they have needs that need to be met, if there's going to be a break or not. I did skip this part of our facilitation today because I have no idea where your bathrooms, lactation stations, water fountains, or refreshments are, because virtually, hopefully you know where those things are. But it's another way to set the tone and bring into the space that multiple identities are present. And it talks about some of those intersecting identities that might have needs and necessities. Some people will come in and ask right away where those things are. And so that might remind you to share that out with everyone in the group, because other folks in the group might need to know it, but they didn't ask you. But that's another way that you can build in that greeting of the participants with some of these pieces here. Having folks introduce themselves, if appropriate, or a part of your presentation. I did not do that today. Why? Because I, A, wasn't aware of how much time I had, and B, in a virtual space, it gets kind of hard, right? And so it's great to do so in the spaces, particularly if you don't have name tags. That way people's names are in there and you might take some notes so you can remember where people are placed. But it's just a great way for folks to know a little bit about each other in the space. Clarifying the purpose of your session helps with inclusion, because it lets people know why we're here together today and where we're going to go. And then present an overview of your session, and then using participants' names, right? So reading people's names off their name tags if you can see them, or when someone shares into the space, acknowledging them with their name, because being honored by your name actually does have some of those scientific feelings. I'm going to say scientific, even though I haven't done the study, but it makes you feel a little bit better, right? It's like, wow, this person actually heard me. They actually remember who I am, or they recognize me in the space. So when we think about skills, we need to think about some of the housekeeping items or some of the foundational things that makes people feel welcome and creates a sense of belonging. Because by doing so, it builds that level of inclusion. And not everyone is always comfortable talking to strangers. Not everyone's always comfortable, putting themselves out there to introduce themselves to people or say hi to folks. And so it's figuring out that balance for yourself and figure out what your skill set and strengths are. For me, I love to memorize people's names on a training session when they don't have name tags, because it gets them to it gives me a little, clout, because they're like, wow, you remember my name? And I'm like, absolutely. I'll forget it once we leave the room together, but at least it helps with building community in this space, because then I can use examples and then use people's names in the space to say, may I ask, I'm going to use your name. Is that okay? So I'm going to use your name. It's sort of like what I did today with Pamela or Emily or Michael or Herman, right? So it's just making sure that folks feel as though they are part of the community in this space. And then we talked about bridging, but this is what bridging might look like, right? So asking participants to recall what was discussed or taught in a previous segment, whether it's maybe the first 15 minutes or if it's a group that meets together on a consistent basis, you're bridging items together. For example, there are some of the answers that you provided in the chat. I've been calling back into the space to say, here's where this might have been heard before. So you're bridging that together because it might help with repetition and also learning for folks. Discussing the outcomes expected from the next topic. So sometimes if we are transitioning by talking about where we're going next from the information, saying, well, we've talked about these items and this is why we've talked about here, so that next we can talk about how to apply it. You're then bridging it together for folks, so you're leaving a lot less up for interpretation. And again, these skills as a facilitator tie together between training and facilitation. But as we talk about facilitation, it's about making sure that all folks are transitioning into the next topic. And we talk about transition and then making connection between topics for participants. So you might be talking about something very meta, or folks are being asked to think very meta-wise. And so then you might give an example or try to make a connection to something that's more tangible for folks in the space. And that can look differently based upon the group that's there or the work that is done by the people in the room, and saying, well, here's a way that might show up in your job. Or you can flip it around as a questioner and say, how might you see that showing up in your job, and get people to think about it that way. And then last but not least, I believe for this section is encouraging participation. So creating a comfortable atmosphere with the climate setting pieces, allowing for silence, right? This is the hard one. Allowing for silence in a virtual space is really hard because you have to give people a chance to type into the chat or get people a chance to sort of awkwardly look at each other if their pictures are up to see if you're going to speak first or that person's going to speak first. And in person, allowing for silence is sometimes that processing. As an external processor, I'll go a mile a minute all the time. Pamela, don't say nothing. And at the same time, internal processors might have to hear it, listen, they're drawing their connection, so they might need a little bit of time. So sometimes counting to 10 in your head, just to give people that time, so you can then focus on what you're going to be going to next, gives you chances to sort of utilize the silence for your purposes necessary, but also gives folks a chance to sort of process. And silence can be very powerful, and sometimes it can be very colluding, right? And so if it's colluding because you're talking about something really charged, as Emily brought into the space, right? Like if you're talking about something inclusion basis and nobody wants to say something, but you know that people need to talk about this topic, you can allow for silence. And then maybe as a facilitator, you then say, so talk to me about why everyone's silent. So then you shift a little bit to talk about the silence and then come back in to then talk about the topic at hand. So you have to learn how to sort of feel that out, and it takes time to figure out what that means, because you don't just want to call out silence. You're like, oh, y'all were silent for 3 seconds. Why ain't nobody saying nothing? Right? You don't want to do that right away, but you need to give yourself that opportunity to think about what is the silence representing, right? And if people still aren't saying anything once you call it out, then that's where you pull in some of those materials that you had pre-prepared that said, well, here's what silence represents at times. Maybe that's what we're going through and what we're feeling. Or maybe you use the opportunity for the silence to say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you all break into groups, smaller groups at your table, or choose one person across the space. And I'd like you to talk about this topic together, and then we'll come back together as a large group. That way people can gather their thoughts and get a chance to externally process with someone else in a smaller space, because maybe they don't feel as comfortable speaking out in a large group too. So there's multiple ways for silence to show up, but you need to make sure that it has its space as well. And then drawing out participants, how to get them to speak without alienating them. So this can be hard. It's sort of fun for me because I like to just call on people randomly and have them speak in spaces, which then makes them very awkward and nervous. And sometimes I even ask those who I know are shy to do it, which makes it even worse, right? That's not very inclusive at all. I'm going to name that, but it's also fun for me. So you have to find a balance for that, right? But how do you get people to speak without alienating them, right? So if Emily hasn't said anything at all, and I'm noticing that, I'm not gonna be like, so Emily, you don't speak. Why ain't you saying nothing? I'm not gonna do it that way, but I might say, so I haven't heard from a few folks today. So I'm gonna ask those who haven't had a chance to have their voices in this space. I'm gonna ask that you share something that you've taken away from today, or something in relation to this topic that stands out for you. Even if it's a question that you have that you need to get answered. And that way I'm sort of trying to draw them in, but I'm not calling them out per se, specifically by sort of embarrassing them or making them feel alienated. And so you have to figure out some of those tips and skills too as well, because the questions are going to matter as to how you frame them. Latoya says, or people may think you are frozen. That's fantastic. Are you referring to the fact in a virtual atmosphere that people are going to think you're frozen because you haven't said something? All right, so if I just did this, like, people are gonna start thinking like, what's going on? I get, that's a good one. No, that happens a lot, particularly in the virtual atmosphere.
Yeah.
You were gonna say something?
So, like, if I was gonna say, like, you know, when I try to create silence, I let people know, like, I'm not frozen, like, this is purposeful.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's a great way of explaining what we talked about earlier, right? Around, like, as a facilitator, you sometimes have to explain what you're doing and why you're doing it and what's going on. So that way folks know what's happening. And in a virtual environment, it's that much more important. I like that. Sometimes I don't like to share that. I just like to just try to freeze as much as possible, particularly when I'm on family calls. Because then they start talking and saying, well, he must be frozen. He'll come back later. And I just sit there and hold my breath as long as possible. But, you know, try that on your own time. It's practice. So what I'm going to do is we're going to do small group breakout. I'm going to get you all into groups. And what we're going to do is we're going to have you sort of talk about what comes most natural for you when facilitating based upon the skills that we just sort of talked about. I was going to say, I don't have that access, Emily, and then I realized I do. So we are going to do 5, 6, nope, 6, 7. We're going to do 7 rooms. So there'll be about 4 or 5 of you per space. Emily is put into the chat the question that's there. So that should still be a part of your chat when you go to the breakout rooms. And we'll probably give you about 5-ish minutes to have a conversation related to this. Cool? And we'll bring you back. Let's see, make sure this is working. And okie dokie.
Hi.
Did
it keep recording?
I don't. Welcome back. So I'm going to ask just 2 volunteers to share something that came up for you in the space, what you realized was most natural for you when facilitating. And since I can't see all the faces, I'm just going to ask you to unmute and then I'll pay attention to that screen.
That's a great
Cody.
observation. Because that was one thing that Mariah and I talked about is being internal processors, allowing for silence so that people have a chance to process their feelings. And being an introvert, sometimes like those small group sessions are a lot more helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cody. One other folks?
I think, hey everyone. So for me, I was sharing with my group the need for reading a room, right? And just being like, are people kind of dozing off? Or are they kind of like fake sleeping in the background, right? Like, and how can we get that energy back up? Because energy levels can affect how someone takes in the information. So I was talking about how I typically split people into like pair sharing or small groups to just kind of get everybody engaged if they don't feel comfortable engaging in a larger sense. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I like how you talked about paying attention if people are like falling asleep or if the energy is low. And so how do you put intentional things in the space to do that? And sometimes the dyads get tricky too, right? So doing a lot of these trainings, what I've started noticing as I moderate and host some of these is that when folks get sent into small groups, they disappear. So case in point, we had 35 people at the beginning of this session. Now we're down to 32. Hello, anybody gonna tell their story, right? So these are things to think about, right? And as you pay attention, you might be like, who was that person that left? I don't know who that person was. And so sometimes you know who that person is, sometimes you don't. But it's paying attention to those pieces because putting them in dyads might not always work either because someone might leave and then you have a person just sitting there by themselves. Or we've had tech issues where someone's only on their phone, but they don't have a camera or their audio is not working. And so they have to chat and type everything. And so how do you make sure you set all of those things up too? Good contributions, Pedro and Cody. Thank you so much. We are going to move on. Why? Because I always run out of time. So processing. So this one there is 3 keys to processing that I like to use and share. And these 3 things are the head, the heart, and the hands, right? And so after activities, or if you put activities as part of a facilitation that you're doing, and even a part of a training that you're doing, how do you process that is important, right? So what we just did is we did a small group, had you come back and we processed it. I didn't use the 3 levels, why, and the 3 keys because I didn't have time. But you might start thinking about the head, right? So what are you thinking about? What is happening in your head? What are you thinking? Because a lot of times we know that there are thinking and feeling personalities and approaches for folks, but sometimes we just need to think with our heads, and we want to offer that opportunity for folks to say, what are you rationalizing? What's happening for you in your head? And that's where you really want to focus that part of the processing debriefing is really around maybe asking some questions related to, as I find it, what are your thoughts or reactions to the activity or the conversation that you just had? What happened during the activity so people can recall what they remember seeing? What role did you find yourself playing depending upon the activity? So you're giving them a chance to think through things and process in their mind. Then you switch and transition into sort of the heart area, right? And it doesn't have to be where you're so rigid with it, where you're like, we're going to process the head. Only think about this, right? And now we're going to move into the heart. You don't have to worry about transitioning in the same way, but it's how you build your questions, right? And so you might just have 3 questions, one that's head focused, one that's heart focused, and one that's hands focused. And so the next one with the heart is thinking around how you felt as a part of during the activity or what was going on, right? And so you might say, how did you feel to do that activity? How did it feel to do that activity? Or what did you feel like when you did this based upon what you observed? And so that gives folks a chance to then enter in with their heart and their emotions and their feelings of what's coming up for folks, because then you can tie that and bridge that together with maybe some of the things that came up from what they were thinking. Because sometimes our thoughts and our feelings don't always connect or don't always intersect in a way that comes together when you think about inclusion. And then for me, I really like the hands part because it's really around how do you get people to then take action with what it is they're thinking and what it is they're feeling, right? So you might say, and this really, I like to look at it as the application. So now that we've had this activity or we've had this discussion, then you might ask a question, how does this relate to your job or to the work that you do, right? What are some things that you can take away from this activity that you can begin implementing right away, right? What's one thing that you learned about yourself that you're going to try and work towards doing differently? Because then it gets folks out of their head, out of their feelings, and into a space of, okay, now that I know this about myself or about this topic, this is what I can actually do with this information. And so when we process, it's really around making sure that all folks have a way to enter in a way that feels comfortable and confident for them, but also make sure that people are guided to a space of actually doing something with what it is they're learning. And this can be very important when you're thinking about inclusion, when you're talking about topics related to diversity and equity, right? Because there's going to be, when you think about privilege and how that plays into processing, most people with privilege are probably going to sit in some places, well, depending upon who they are, right? Because I'm going to generalize in some things, but some folks with privilege identities might sit in a place of thinking only because they don't want to feel what's going on for them, right? So they're going to say, well, I think what's happening is, and they're going to try to rationalize, and they're going to try to find that one example that doesn't match what you're sharing, right? So when I hear about some of you all thinking around losing the group or not knowing what to say, it comes in with the processing because people are going to start sharing their opinions. And with that privilege piece, they're going to stay in their head. So how do you move them into their heart? So when you ask a feeling question, like how does it make you feel? And someone says, well, I think it's just interesting that, you know, we have to talk about this topic. That's great. I think it's interesting. We should talk about this topic too. How does it make you feel to have to talk about this topic? See how I just walked them into that corner right there? And then in my head, I sort of pat myself on the back and be like, shade, right? But you don't have to let people know that that's what you just did. But that's where you can give yourself your own motivation. But it's really rephrasing that, saying, thank you so much for adding that. So I'm going to ask the question in a different way for you, if I may, right? How do you feel about that? What's going on for you inside? Like, how are you feeling about that being an issue, right? And then when you get to the hands part, most people are going to say, well, I just feel it's hard to do this. Okay, so what makes it hard to be able to do that? How would you start doing that, right? So that way you can continue to guide them in that processing, because when it comes to inclusion, equity, and diversity, people are going to have those, well, it's them, not me, it's out there, I don't think that way, we're at CSU, it's perfect here. All that's lies, right? And how do you help guide them through that process? So I will make sure that Emily also shares some of those processing questions, because they're not on this screen, but that I'll make sure that she has those to be able to share out with the PowerPoint. So addressing conflict, this is where the sort of the rubber hits the road. I don't know if that's the right colloquialism for this moment, but we know that conflict is going to happen, right? When you come into a place and inclusion is the center part of it, and we talked about earlier that inclusion should be at the center of all we do as a facilitator / trainer / educator / living in human life and looking at people for the human dignity that they deserve to have. If we are supposed to center inclusion into all of that, conflict is going to be there, right? And so how we address that and what we prepare ourselves for is the key to finding a way to stay sort of ahead of the game and proactive in that approach. So what I'm going to share are a few steps, kind of some steps of intervention there, but also share different types of conflicting style, which we all probably know. Try to provide an example here or there. We're down to 31 now, but I'm not keeping track. And so, oh, I'm sorry, that was so rude of you. That was not very inclusive. I don't know who it is though, so I'm not going to name it. Becca, I know you were looking for who I'm going to name, but I'm not going to name that person. But we're going to talk about a few ways to intervene, and then we're also going to talk about the different styles of conflict that are there. So one way to address conflict is always to utilize guidelines that you may have set up, right? So at the beginning of training sessions or facilitation sessions, there's usually some guidelines that we all ask people to engage. Make some, I don't like to say rules of engagement because rules seems really weird and rigid, but like some community guidelines, some engagement practices. And if you have those outlined that folks have been privy to, then you can always refer back to that and say, well, you know, if we can remember the guidelines, we ask that, right? One of my favorites is, you know, share airtime. I know Emily likes to talk, so I'm always in a space with Emily. I'm always making sure I highlight that one and give her a little side eye when I highlight it. And if Emily's always talking, I'm gonna be like, so remember our guidelines when we talk to share airtime. I just wanna make sure there's some other voices that we can get into the space, right? And there's ways to do that, again, without alienating people. What I just did was a bad example. That was alienating. Do as I say, not as I do. And then the other piece is intervening, right? So there's the dominating conversationalist. So the person who is always speaking, or the person who is just on a 7-minute talk and they just continue to go, go, go. How do you intervene with that? And sometimes it's just waiting for a pause, or sometimes it's just having to be that in that rude space saying, look, I know that you still had a few things to share, but I'm going to interrupt because I want to make sure that we're able to hold all the things that you've brought into this space, right? So you might need to take some notes yourself about some of the things that they've said so that you can then tie it back to that, and then say, we're going to break down some of those thoughts, and I'm going to ask you to write down a few of the things that you were going to finish up, but I want to make sure that the rest of the folks in the space have a chance to respond before we lose it, right? So you're giving qualifiers as to why you're interrupting, and you're giving qualifiers as to what you're going to do next, so that they don't feel as though they can't share, but at the same time, you need them to stop talking, right? Because we all have one of those people. I might be that person for you this afternoon. Who knows? Excuse me for 1 second. And then there's conflicting opinions when appropriate. I'm about to sneeze. Hold on, I'm gonna have to mute this. Oh, that's about to happen. That would have been dangerous. I just saw projectiles hitting the camera, and that would have been wrong. So that would have been bad. So, and then conflicting opinions when appropriate, right? And so, and it's about how do you intervene with conflicting opinions when appropriate amongst each other, and not only conflicting with you, right? So again, as we think about facilitation, we are not supposed to be the center of everything when we're facilitating. And so if someone brings something in that conflicts with something you've asked or done, it's about reframing that and then bringing that into the space and being okay with that and allowing that to happen, and not just cutting that person off. But then on the flip side, allowing people just to go back and forth, or just, it's about balancing that listening that we talked about earlier. So if folks are having conflicting opinions, you might need to intervene and cut it off depending upon where it's going. And at the same time, you might need to let it happen, because we talked about what it means to be a facilitator with contrary opinions and views. So I'm going to go through really quickly, and I'm going to skip over some of these because I've talked about them previously as well. But the type of conflictors, I think there's 8 here. And so you might know who, that was thoughtful. No face coverings on virtual. That's fun. I will not. Okay, thank you. So type of conflictors. So the talker, right? We know that there is a talker. We know that there's a person who will always be the person that's going to try and share as much as they can and not be quiet. And those are the folks that we sort of have to pay attention to, because those are the ones that I mentioned earlier that you might have to interrupt. You might have to say, you've raised a good point. Let's make sure we get other people's voices in on that. Sometimes the talker is someone, and we have to pay attention inclusive-wise that cultures engage and communicate differently too, right? So based upon the culture that the person might be from, they might need to tell a story because they have high context storytelling to be able to get to the point. And so you need to be able to be mindful of some of the differences of the cross-cultural communication pieces that are coming in as well. And that's not always to say that it's still okay for someone to talk for 10 minutes when you only had 3 minutes to process, but you need to be mindful of where those folks might show up. There's the know-it-all. This is my personal favorite because this is who I am. You think that you have all the, or I should say, I know I have all the answers, and so therefore I'm just going to always say everything because I have all the right answers, and I'm always going to raise my hand and answer everything. That's not going to help either, right? And so you might need to figure out how to make sure that if they're always putting their hand up first, you might need to acknowledge them with a, I see that your hand's up, I'm going to make sure that we get some other voices into the space, right? That works as a great deterrent for a lot of the different type of conflict, by at least acknowledging someone and validating that you see them, and then moving on to someone else, because they raise their hand doesn't mean they have to be the person that answers. And the tension there is that people might get used to the know-it-all and the talkers in the space. So therefore they will then choose not to engage at all. And so therefore you might have to use some other tips and tricks, such as some of the things that were brought up. And I think Pedro, you brought up breaking people into dyads to talk in small groups. Cody, you talked about that as well. around maybe introversion or internal processors. And so just being mindful of when to use those tips and skills. There's the show off. This person just likes to be the gold star recipient for the day. They can be very fun. They can stroke your ego and make you feel like you're doing a fantastic job. And at the same time, they could deter other people from engaging as well. And so with the show off, you're also going to want to make sure that you acknowledge, but you might need to ask them a thought-provoking question to make them go deeper, right? Because your eager beavers and your show-offs might just have a simple answer. They might be able to say, oh, I know that. Here's the 3 steps. Okay, so talk to me about how those 3 steps can be applied, right? They might have the head processing down, but they might not be able to process the hands part of the conversation. And so how do you ask them a thought-provoking question to get them to go a little bit deeper? The other piece is the whiner. They're fun. I don't really have a lot to say about a whiner in this case, but they might have a legitimate concern about what they're whining about. And other times they just want to be a gripe, right? They just want to say, well, that's not the case. Well, that's not the case. And I know I mentioned earlier that there's that one person who sits in a place of privilege who might only be able to come in it from a headspace of try to shade you or shame you or try to find that one obscure stat that says, well, my friend down the road whose college son's roommate's brother's sister-in-law went to college and they didn't have that experience. They're just trying to gripe, or they're trying to, deter the conversation because they don't want to realize that this is actually a real phenomenon and trend. And so you might need to acknowledge them and say, well, thank you so much. That was a very obscure relational tip into this conversation. However, for you, how do you think this works, right? So again, it's always reframing and asking those questions back to the person. There's a rambler who can go on and on when they speak. We've talked about this. This is where you might use that tip of, okay, you just interrupt and say, okay, you've mentioned a lot of points and I don't want to lose them because I've seen a lot of energy, or I know that there's a lot of people who might want to weigh in on this. So can we just deal with the first 3 points that you made, and then maybe if we have time, come back to the rest. It feels awkward to interrupt people, feels uncomfortable to interrupt people. If you think about your own personal identities in that situation, interrupting people might look different. So as a male identified cisgendered person, as I am presenting, if it is a female identified or non-gender conforming person speaking and they are starting to ramble and I interrupt them, there could be a silencing that's going on based upon our identities, which might not feel good. And I might have to name it that way. Or I might have to just say, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. And I want to, because I want to make sure that we tie into what's going on. Still might not feel good. Still might not make that person feel good. But you have to think about the greater group sometimes. You have to think about what's going on and what's happening. And so you have to walk that fine line of what that's going to be and around that conflict. And you have to think about, if they're going to keep going and they're going to eat up all your time, are you going to get to what it is that you need to get to as well? And so you need to figure out how to find that balance for what works for you. And you'll be able to tell if you're looking at the group and you see, if you notice there's a person who's in one of these styles who starts talking and you start noticing eye rolls or people shifting uncomfortably or people starting to tilt their head to the side. And if you notice that that's occurring, but that person's not realizing it, it might be an opportunity for learning and talking, and again, a nice sidebar for your conversation to facilitate as well, without calling people in on what they've experienced or what they're doing. There's the heckler, which I think is the conflict that always is what we worry about the most when we're talking about inclusion. This is the person who tries to attack the credibility of the subject or you as the facilitator or trainer, right? And so this is the person that I like to most prepare for. Because if they're a heckler, these are the folks that I don't mind shading or being petty towards, because they sort of bring it on themselves. We can talk about that sidebar afterwards if you'd like to talk deeper about that. But for these folks, this is where my clapbacks come in. This is where my stats and my rattling off information to share with them that, no, what we're talking about is legit and validating, and you need to be able to hear this and think differently. Or where you do some acrobatic things with your communication to reframe what they're saying to say, so tell me more about why you think that this is not the case. Or you seek an example to bring into the space. Because the heckler can be the most detracting person, but the heckler can also be the most attacking to you personally. The searcher is someone who put you on the spot by soliciting you for advice or support for their views. And so the searcher might not be as bad as the heckler because they're just sort of like well, don't you agree that we need this? And it's like, and they're trying to ask you, well, in my office, I have this situation, or as in my classroom, I dealt with this. Can you help me to figure out how I could do this next? And sometimes pulling one or two of those examples in works, because then it becomes a case study for everyone. So how do you then open it up to everyone? So what do folks say, if you were in this experience, what would you do? And you can also then, if they continue to ask that, say, hey, let's talk about that during the break or after the session, and we'll have some time at the end to address a few more of those pieces. And usually that will, the searcher will be okay with that, and they'll then seek you out afterwards. And then you might need to make sure you have an out, because then they might corner you and talk to you for long periods of time. And then last but not least is a silent type. They're the ones that just sit there silent for many reasons. They're either processing, they feel that they're superior, they might lack self-confidence, they might feel that they have nothing to contribute. And so you need to figure out why that silence might be for those folks. If you notice that they're writing down notes and that they're paying attention and that they're nodding, it's because that's their style of learning maybe, right? And they might not have nothing to say to the out group. If you see them just leaning back and have their head tilt, you might pan that, but then you need to figure out if that's because they really don't like the information, they don't agree with it, are they tired, are they thinking about something else, or do they feel like they're superior? And you might not be able to figure that out completely, but paying attention to some of the cues that they're giving off based upon their body language can help with how you engage differently. So when someone asks a question and people are popcorning in, every once in a while scanning the room to see where that person is, to see how their responses might change and shift might be important. In this virtual space, you might not see everyone. Why? Because you can't get all the people on one screen as it is with this one, or you have a lot of screens open because you're moderating like this, and so I can't see everyone's face, or people don't have their cameras on. And so it makes it a lot difficult with the silent type in these types of environments. And so then that's where you use the chat, or you get them in the smaller groups to ensure that people are talking and trying to engage. So the types of conflictors all have different ways of engaging and sharing. But a way that all of these, though, can be addressed with these 4 different pieces here. Ask questions, right? As a facilitator, you are a questioner. That is one of the roles that you play. So always asking questions, reframing the question, answering their question with a question is always a great way too, because then if someone says, well, what do you mean when you say that? Well, what do you think I mean when I say that? And if their response is like, like they might see what you're trying to do. If they get angry, then you're like, okay, so talk to me about why you're angry, because I want you to figure this out, right? Or you can see that if they're getting fed up with you asking questions, then you might need to slip into a space of either asking other folks to share information, or you might need to step into a way of disseminating information. Validating contributions is important. Even if you don't agree with what someone says, by just saying, thank you for sharing that, doesn't mean you agree with what they're saying, right? You can start off with, thank you for sharing that. What's coming up for me is, and then you can explain an answer or reframe it back, or you can say, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone have an opinion based upon what was just put into the space? That way they feel validated that their contributions matter and they're being heard, but you're not necessarily agreeing with them, right? So validation does not always equal agreement. And so it's important to remember that, because if you leave it to be silent, you might have shut them down. If that's what you're going for, then go for it. But if you shut them down, other people in this space might feel that you might do the same thing to them, and now you might have alienated the whole group without even trying. So just remember saying thank you for your contribution, or thank you for saying that, or thank you. That's an interesting point. Can you tell me more about what you mean when you said this, right? So that way you're also, as the facilitator, staying in control of the space. And then be perceptive, pay attention to what's going on. How people are moving, what people are not doing, what people are saying, who is answering and who's not answering, and then help the group learn, right? So utilizing a conflict as a way for folks to learn. So you could even name it. So what I noticed for myself when this person said this is that I started getting hot, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up a little bit, because it made me think about some of the feelings that I have around X, Y, and Z, right? So you can use that as an opportunity to sort of help the group learn how conflict can be good for learning, because it moves into that taking risk space and leaning into your comfort zone and moving up to that learning edge. So what we are going to do is process as a small group, but we only have 9 minutes together. Why? Because we are fantastic. So I want you to think about this at some point. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint about what makes you nervous with conflict, because that if you can identify what makes you nervous, you can then proactively address what that means as you go into spaces. So some things to remember are learning styles of the group, as well as your own learning styles. If you're someone that can't always think on your feet of an answer, then have 1 or 2 questions that you can always reframe back if someone asks you a question, and let them answer it while you're thinking of something, right? That's not very good active listening as a facilitator, but you need to also give yourself that time to process, or even sometimes just naming it. You know what, that's a great question. I'm gonna come back to that because I want to think about it a little bit more. Is that okay, right? And giving folks those types of spaces. The flow and the time, I did not prepare flow and time well at all with this. I thought I had more time than what I was gonna use, but you know, you have to figure out that sometimes preparing more will always help you out, because if you fall short, you might need to fill that time differently, but if you have too much information, then you might not get to your main points. So finding that flow and time is important. Giving yourself planning time. So as I talked about earlier, figuring out what are the contrary views that might come up when you're talking about inclusion or diversity or any type of topic that you're about to talk about. Think about what potential answers or questions people might ask you. I apologize, the lawnmower is outside and mowing, so if you hear that background noise, I apologize, because that's about to happen. But think about how you can prepare those answers so that way when they come up, you're ready. If they don't come up, you still have information that you can still use in other ways. Thinking about the environment. So if you're going to be physically in a space, how the environment's set up, where the environment is, even if you're in a virtual space, thinking about what kind of space that you have for yourself to be comfortable, and also who's in that environment. Who are the folks making up the environment? Because that's going to matter as to the type of examples you use and the ways in which you try to get folks to engage. And then the ground rules, and as I said, I don't really like using rules, but thinking about the engagement guidelines or community engagement ways, thinking about how you can set those up to use that as a way to create a safe and maybe vulnerable filled environment that builds into a brave space. So then self-awareness as a facilitator, these are the 4 things that I think should be thought about when you think about yourself, right? So what is your depth of understanding? What do you know about this topic? What don't you know about this topic? What do you think you need to learn about this topic so that you feel more comfortable with what it is you're bringing forward? You're never going to know everything. You will never be an expert on everything that might come up in the space, but can you know a little bit and enough about enough? And again, it goes back to that planning time of proactively preparing yourself, but to have that so that you can utilize the knowledge that you do have. Understanding what your personal hot buttons are key. If you know that the minute someone says a certain word and it's going to trigger you, or it's going to send you into a place where you have to truly think about the reaction you're going to have, you need to know what those are. You might not be able to still handle them any differently, but knowing that that's a trigger for you, if you're co-facilitating, sharing that with your co-facilitator. So if your co-facilitator hears the word or sees or engage or knows that that person is engaging you, they can then step in and start leading the session while you take some time to sort of reflect, go into yourself, and rejuvenate differently. But your personal hot buttons are very, very key because it can derail you in facilitating. And I think it goes back to some of the things that folks shared around being anxious. Around being anxious, or not having all the information, or not knowing the language to use, or how to bring people into the space, or engagement pieces, right? And so just knowing that. And then storytelling, I like to use as an example of, if you are facilitating and knowing your audience, that as a facilitator, it's not necessarily about us per se, as the last bullet point says, but knowing that if you need to provide an example, sometimes personalizing that for yourself gets people more into the mood of being vulnerable, because they say, oh, this person is sharing a personal story. But being able to practice what those personal stories are for you, so that you can drive that home and bridge that connection and transition differently and utilize an example as a facilitator that's personal to you, so you can speak to that more often. It's very, very key and important that way. Because the more you practice telling your story, the more you are aware of your story and know how to share it, the more you are able to bring people into your conversation, as well as to be able to make sure that you're driving home the points that you need to drive home. And then last but not least around that self-awareness is that it's not about us, right? The way in which some of the folks enter into the space has nothing to do with you. They might be focusing it on you, but it has nothing to do with you. And so you can use that as a way of deflecting them by saying, sounds like you are putting a lot of things towards me and I'm just trying to make sure what that's about, right? Or sounds like there's a lot of energy for you. You want to talk about what's going on for you a little bit further? Because right now I'm confused as to where you're centering your conversation or your point that you're trying to make. And so it's sometimes asking those questions. But if we take it personally, which we can never not stop, right? Because we all have identities, experiences, and stories that are complex and intersecting that drive who we are as people. But if we can remember that it's not us that are the ones that are always at the center of someone's frustration or misunderstanding, we're there to help facilitate that learning for them as a part of the group dialogue as a learner or as a facilitator. And so how do we help them realize that they need to do that work, right? And that it's, you know, and while there still might be an impact on us, because we know there's intent and impact, right? But while there might be an impact on us, it's about managing some of those hot buttons as a facilitator. And sometimes as a facilitator, you might have to get about it, right? You might have to share with someone what you truly think about them. Those are my favorite moments. They're very far and few in between, but sometimes you might just have to clap back and let somebody know that who they is not really welcome right now, right? And so if those are the moments, you need to do some cost and benefit analysis of what you're doing in the space, who you're working with, who you might see. Hierarchy is real. If they are in a space that they're a supervisor, or they know your supervisor, just know that that might be it. And so you might need to talk to your supervisor immediately after, say, look, you might get a call from this person because I just told them about themselves and their mama and they didn't really appreciate it, but this is what happened and why it happened. In hopes that they will back you up. And if they don't, then you might say, well, let's talk about inclusion for you too, because you ain't being inclusive of supporting me. So thinking around how all of that plays into the situation is a part of this as well around our self-awareness. We have to know that what we're bringing and why we're doing what we're doing is important, right? And what we're bringing to the table is important. And if we are asked to facilitate, we're being asked for a reason. So know that you have a level of expertise that is being sought out. And how do you supplement that knowledge as a facilitator, being mindful of inclusion as a practice? So I want to leave you with this statement here. It talks about facilitation is both exciting and scary because you cannot be totally prepared. Every group discussion will have different people and therefore different dynamics, conversations, and results. Thus, the most important tool for facilitators is flexibility. Prepare introductory statements and general questions and then be prepared for anything to happen, right? So flexibility and adaptability are going to be key, and particularly when you're thinking about inclusion, because you're going to have people who come in basic, who are afraid to even use the word of a social identity. And then you're going to have others who are coming in ready to be activists on the streets. And how are you going to balance that space and hold that? And a lot of times as a facilitator, you let them go for it at the moment, just sit back and eat some popcorn and watch it unfold, right? Because they're going to learn from each other and teach one another. And you just have to manage the respect and the dignity in this space to ensure that people are hearing each other and it's not just becoming a shouting match, because that's when the learning gets lost. Okay, 60 seconds left. Questions, thoughts? Alicia said being stung. Oh, nope, sorry, I'm all the way at the top of the chat. That's not even right. The mower is pretty muted. We can't really hear it. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a private message. I shouldn't have read. Thanks, Kyle. This is fun. So these are the ways in which it works, right? You have to be willing to laugh at yourself. You have to be willing to be vulnerable in a lot of spaces. And it's okay to be that, right? Like I've made fun of myself multiple times, as well as a few of you all in the space, but I do love you. And it's about building community and connections, because in those moments, people will remember and recall things a lot easier. So thank you all for being here and starting off SHAPE week of training. It's going to be fantastic. There are multiple other sessions that are coming your way. Please check out the SHAPE website for more trainings that are available, brought to you by Slice and the LSC. The word for that is our secret word for the day, SHAPE.
Kyle, thank you so much. I highly encourage folks, if you still have questions, reach out to Kyle. Thank you. I can't even think of anyone better to kick us off for this week. Kyle, thank you so much for what you've shared. I hope some of you will stick around. We're going to get ready for our next session. This is the tightest turnaround we have all week. meaning that our next session starts at 1:20. Usually there's about half an hour or so in between the sessions. But thanks for everyone for being in here, and you can find this on YouTube, so if someone wasn't able to catch it, we'll be posting that in the next week. So have a great day. Kyle, thank you, and we'll see you on the other side.
Sorry, I took too much time.